Welcome back. We just discussed how we can refactor some code into functions that we can use and reuse in our program. In this video, we're going to refactor the code for updating our animation data, and we're going to reuse this function for both Scarfy and the nebulae. So here inside our check to see if is_in_air is false, we're updating the animation frame using this code. This is the code we want to refactor. So let's go ahead and create our new function. Let's scroll all the way up just outside the main function, and we'll put our new function just under isOnGround. Now this new function is going to return an anim data, and we're going to call this update anim data. Now it's going to take an anim data as an input parameter, and we're going to call this data. Now part of what we need to do is take our data's running time and add delta time to that. So we're going to have a float input parameter called delta time. So the first thing we do in update anim data is update running time. That's why we needed delta time. Let's make a comment that says update running time, and let's access the running time in our input parameter data. So data.runningTime, and we'll use the plus equals operator and add delta time to that. Next, we need to check to see if running time is greater than or equal to the update time member variable. So we're going to check if data.runningTime is greater than or equal to data.updateTime. If running time is greater than or equal to update time, we need to reset running time to 0. So we're going to say data.runningTime equals 0.0. Next, we actually update the animation frame. So let's add a comment that says update animation frame. Now this involves setting the rec.x value. So we're going to get data.rec.x, and we set this using the frame times the rec.width. So we're going to assign it the value of data.frame times data.rec.width. After this, we update frame by incrementing it by 1. So we're going to say data.frame++. And finally, we need to check to see if frame needs to be reset to 0. So we're going to check to see if data.frame is greater than a certain amount. Now, this amount is 5 when we're updating Scarfy's animation frame, because as soon as the frame reaches 6, we need to go back to frame 0, as Scarfy only has 6 frames to choose from. But in the case of the nebulae, this value is 7, because there's only 8 nebulae to choose from in that top row. So as soon as the nebulae frames reach 8, we need to reset it to 0. So for this reason, we can have an input parameter for this function of type int, and we can use this as the max frame value. So let's add a new input parameter of type int and call this max frame. And we'll check to see if data.frame is greater than this value max frame. So then we'll simply need to pass this in whenever we call this function. Now, if data.frame is greater than max frame, then we need to set data.frame back to 0. So now we have this function that takes in an anim data as a copy and changes it. So now we simply need to return that value from this function. So we're going to use the return keyword and return data. Now we have a function that will return an anim data after updating its animation variables. Now we can call this function when we're updating Scarfy's animation frame. Let's scroll back down to where we're doing that. So here, we're updating Scarfy's animation frame with this code. But instead, we're going to call our new function and use its return value and assign that value to Scarfy data. So in this if check, we're going to delete these lines of code, and instead, we're going to say Scarfy data equals, and then we'll call our new function update anim data. Now, update anim data takes 3 inputs. The first is an anim data, and we're going to pass in Scarfy data. Next, we need delta time, so we're going to pass in dt. And finally, we need our max frame, which for Scarfy is going to be 5. So now all those lines of code inside this if body have been replaced by a single line that uses our new function. We've effectively refactored the interior of this if statement. Now we can go ahead and hit run and start debugging just to make sure that Scarfy is animated correctly. Here's Scarfy, and everything seems to be working just fine. Now here's your challenge. We've created this function updateAnimData, and it's actually quite useful because we used it to replace all the code that was updating Scarfy's animation variables. Well, we could use this for the nebulae as well. So I want you to refactor the updating animation frame code for each nebula. Pause the video and give this a try. Okay, so here's our program, and just under Scarfy's animation frame update, we have a for loop looping through our array and updating the animation frame for each nebula. We're going to replace these lines of code by calling updateAnimData. Now we have our nebulae array, and we can access an individual element of that array using the index I in our for loop. So we're going to take nebulae of I and assign it a new value using updateAnimData. So we're going to say nebulae of I and use the assignment operator and assign it the value returned by updateAnimData. Now for updateAnimData, we need to pass in an animData. We're going to pass in the current element of nebulae, so it's going to be nebulae of I. Next, we need to pass in delta time, so we'll use dt. And finally, the max frame for the nebulae will be 7. So now we've replaced all the code inside the for loop with a single function call to updateAnimData. And we're using that return value to update nebulae of I. Now we can hit run and start debugging just to make sure that our nebulae are animated correctly. And here they are. Looks like everything is just fine. So in summary, we've created a function called updateAnimData for updating Scarfy's animation frame. We then reuse that function to update each nebula in the nebulae array. This shows us just how much more efficient our code can be when we refactor any repeated code into a function that we can reuse. Great job! I'll see you in the next video.